Institute for Society and Genetics, so a small round of applause that we are now at Institute. And to kick off our Institute seminar series, we have our very own Clark Barrett, who's here at UCLA. He's an associate professor, and he has a very broad background. He's coming from BA in biology at Harvard, and then went to anthropology for his master's and doctoral work at UC Santa Barbara, and then a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute. And so he's here as an evolutionary psychologist, and he's generally interested in explaining the mechanisms in the brain that allow people across cultures to act in ways that promote different types of behavior, such as cooperation and social tolerance for others. And so here he's in the Center for Behavior, Evolution, Culture, the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development, and officially in the Department of Anthropology. So an excellent person to come to our series. So without further ado,
Great.
Introduce Clark.
Thanks. Thanks, Jen, and thanks to Jessica as well for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. Lots of familiar faces here. For those of you who don't know me, as Jen said, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and I study the evolution of cognition. And in my empirical work, I use cross-cultural comparisons of cognitive development, cognition in adults and children, to try to triangulate universals and variation in human cognition and cognitive development. And in my theoretical work, complementary to that, I've been trying to develop more biologically realistic models of what cognitive adaptations might be and how they might evolve. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. And first what I want to do is describe to you what I think is a major problem in the social sciences in thinking about adaptations in the brain and what they might be. I'm then going to turn to a few examples, very, very briefly, one example from my own work and a couple examples from others' research that kind of point out problems with the current alternatives that are on the table for thinking about brain specializations in the social sciences, some challenges that we're going to need to explain about humans. Then I'm going to turn to the main portion of the talk, which is going to be the theoretical ingredients that I think we're going to need to end up in order to have a full account of the evolution of human cognition. And these are going to include some well-known ingredients and some lesser-known ingredients, including some ingredients that are well-known in evolutionary biology, but that haven't really been applied very broadly in the social sciences yet. And then finally, I'm going to turn to some suggestions about what it might look like, what the evolution of cognition, what the study of the evolution of cognition might look like when we apply these theoretical ingredients to it, and discuss some implications for what this means about the future of research in this area. So the problem, and I think this is one of the biggest problems that we face in the social sciences in thinking about evolutionary psychology, the evolution of mind and behavior, is a kind of impasse. We've reached a point where views in this field are quite polarized, and the available options for explaining human cognition, or at least the perceived available options for explaining human cognition, really don't cover the full set of options that we should be making use of. And so to illustrate this, I want to give you two examples of the opposite ends of this polarized spectrum in the social sciences. So the first comes from my own discipline, evolutionary psychology, and here's a typical quote from an evolutionary psychologist, Leo Cosmides and John Tooby, who say that the mind is a set of information processing machines that were designed by natural selection, and I put in brackets there adaptations because that's just a synonym for a mechanism shaped by natural selection, to solve adaptive problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. And this is close to the view that I'll be endorsing here, with the caveat that, of course, not all mechanisms in the mind evolved specifically to solve problems faced by our hunter-gatherer ancestors, because as you'll see in my talk, I think that in fact the majority of mechanisms in the mind actually are much more ancient than that, albeit perhaps modified. This view is sometimes called massive modularity, a term coined by Dan Sperber in the 90s, and normally I'd be okay with calling myself a massive modularist, although it's become something of a dirty word in psychology and the brain sciences. So I'd be happy with, say, multiple modularists, as long as we agree that there's probably more than one, then I'm okay with it. So let me now contrast this. So that you probably know, if you've read anything about evolutionary psychology, that it's quite controversial. It's come in for a lot of criticism, and specifically the view that I just presented on the last slide, although it might seem reasonable to you the way that I presented it, has generated quite a bit of controversy. So Jerry Fodor, who's widely credited with introducing the idea of modularity into the cognitive sciences, has called this specific view modularity theory gone mad. So if the guy who came up with the idea of modules as we use it in cognitive science thinks that this is modularity theory gone mad, that indicates a problem. And philosopher of biology David Fuller has said that the brand of evolutionary psychology I just described is wrong in almost every detail. So these guys aren't really pulling any punches. So what's the alternative? Let me now describe what's widely perceived as the alternative to that view in psychology, and those are what are sometimes called domain general accounts. And there's lots of quotes that I could have picked to illustrate this, but here's one from two prominent neuroscientists, Kort and Sinowski, in a widely cited paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences on constructivism in neuroscience, where they say the developing cerebral cortex is largely free of domain-specific structure. Now we can get into the details about what they mean by domain-specific structure, but in a nutshell, this can be interpreted as saying there are no specialized adaptations in the cortex. Here's philosophers Buller and Hardcastle, who say, in an even more extreme claim, with the possible exception of our sensory transducers, it is not the contingently stable brain structures in an adult's brain that are adaptations. Rather, the brain's very developmental plasticity is the adaptation. Okay, now, let me pause for a moment to point out that what they mean here, what a sensory transducer is an organ that takes external information like light waves or sound or air pressure waves and turns it into neural format inside the brain, so your retina or your cochlea. Essentially what they're saying is that everything inside the skull is one single giant adaptation for plasticity. The only adaptations that we have are our retinas and our cochlea, and everything else is one giant adaptation. Now, these are very extreme differences of opinion. I think that we can all agree. It's a problem, and if you imagine a problem of this magnitude in another field like chemistry, imagine one side that says matter is made of atoms, and another side that says, no, it's not. That's essentially the situation that we're in, because the idea of a mechanism in the brain that processes information in some functional way is necessary for psychology. It's a critical part of brain science in general, and so what you have here are supposed experts on the evolution of the brain looking at the very same data, looking at the very same facts, and coming to opposite conclusions about those facts. And it's hard to understate the importance of that problem. So, what are the possible ingredients of the solution to this problem? One thing that we need to do is realize that there's a lot of heated rhetoric in this area, and in those kinds of conditions, people tend to polarize themselves in their positions, and often they tend to define their position as the opposite of whatever the other guy is saying. So it's useful to take a step back and say, what are the reasonable positions that we can identify here? And there are a few points that I want to make from the outset that I hope that we can all agree on. One is that functionally organized cognition and behavior are likely to be the result of some combination of adaptations. So me talking to you right now, me gesturing, my mouth is moving, sound is coming out. You guys are hearing it, you're seeing me talking, you're understanding hopefully what I'm saying. What adaptations are involved is a very good question, but there should be little question that some combination of adaptations is involved in generating this kind of cognition. And probably more than one, I feel safe in saying that, even perhaps in the cortex. And here, if you think back to the Kort and Sinowski quote, what's relatively uncontroversial is that the adult developed cortex contains a lot of, it is not just a single undifferentiated structure, but rather there's functional specialization in different regions of the cortex and different brain networks in the cortex. It's not the case that everything does everything. Rather, it's divided into functional regions and processes. Okay, so we don't know for sure that Quartz and Sinowski are wrong, but it's quite a plausible thing to entertain the possibility that even in the cortex there might be adaptations that are the product of evolution by natural selection. And our job is to figure out what those are. So that, I think, is the part where we can all agree on these different sides of the debate. We should be trying to figure this out rather than deciding in advance what the case might be. And my colleague Rob Kurzban and I proposed in a paper in Psych Review in 2006 that one way around this is to try to look for more biologically realistic views of what we might mean when we talk about adaptations in the brain. So to a biologist, there's no cookie-cutter definition of what an adaptation is. It depends a lot on evolutionary history and on function. The very idea of form-function-fit means that different adaptations look different. And so we have to be prepared when we look inside the brain to not apply a single cookie-cutter definition of adaptation to all brain processes. Unfortunately, I mentioned Jerry Fodor, and unfortunately his definition of modules has really hijacked discussions about specializations in the brain since he proposed it in 1983. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but he proposed a bunch of features that he thought might be characteristic of brain specializations, and I'll just group them into three general categories. One is the idea that they're domain narrow, that adaptations must operate only on some narrow category of information. Another is automaticity. Now this has a variety of different meanings. One meaning is accessible or affectable in some way by conscious processes, by, for example, choice, voluntary effort. But a broader idea is it's automatic if it operates in isolation from other systems. So in cases where you see multiple systems interacting, that would violate Fodor's definition of automaticity. And then finally, he suggests that specialized mechanisms are innate, and there's a very specific meaning here. He means that they develop the same way regardless of experience or differences in the environment. And I think you can see from the outset that if I ask the question, should those three features, do you think that those three features are diagnostic of what an adaptation is? The answer is probably no. And let me give you three short examples of findings in psychology research that challenge the idea that these Fodorian properties are the only properties that adaptations might have. So one of them is from my own work, and this is a study of prepared learning about animal danger in children. And what I mean here by prepared learning is that children, when faced with diverse kinds of information, may not be equally good at learning all of that information. Some information they may learn quickly, some information may take more time or effort. And you can think about this, for example, in terms of the difference that your child might have in learning how to speak their language versus the difference, the ability of your child to learn how to do mathematics, right? There might be quite a difference in how quickly they learn it, how much effort is involved, and so on. And we were interested in danger because there's been research in other species showing that, as you might expect, across different animal species, often danger is quite easily learned. And indeed, there's research in other primates showing social learning of danger, that, for example, primates can acquire fear of snakes by observing another individual showing fear reaction. So to look for this in humans, we did a training study. We've actually done several of these, where we basically give kids cards showing animals that they haven't seen before. And in the experimental group, we teach them, or we tell them the name, we tell them whether it eats plants or animals, and we tell them whether it's safe or dangerous. We also have a control group where we just ask the kids those questions to make sure that they're not familiar with these animals, for example. Immediately after presenting that information, we ask them, we go through the cards and we say, what's this called? Is it safe or dangerous? Does it eat plants or animals? The order of those things is counterbalanced. We don't give them any feedback. We don't tell them if they're right or wrong. And then we come back 1 week later and do the exact same thing. And we've done this with kids in Los Angeles. This is actually partly done at the UCLA daycare, so some of your children might have participated in this study. And also at my field site in Ecuador, these are kids who live in the Amazon region of Ecuador. And the interesting thing here is that these kids face very different environments in terms of danger. So the kids that are living in the Amazon basin the possibility of being attacked by a dangerous animal is much more likely than it is for kids living in LA. And we have comparable groups here. This is an opportunity sample of all the children in a single village, and so the age range is slightly broader than for the LA sample. But what we found here, if you compare these two, is that we found evidence of the prepared learning effect in both populations. If you look at the controls, this is the American kids, they basically didn't know the name of any of the animals, so these are the kids that were asking about the animals without having trained them. And they're at chance on these two binary measures, safe, dangerous, herbivore, carnivore, right? So if you guess, you're going to get 50% right. So basically they don't know anything about these cards. Immediately after training them, when we ask them though, they go to well above chance on the danger information, but not for the other two categories of information. And when we come back 1 week later, they essentially remember it just as well. There's a slight attenuation, but they've remembered it after a week. And we see similar effects with the Schwarr kids. And you'll see that what's interesting about the Schwarr kids is their memory, you see the exact same effect. The effect size is about the same. Their memory overall is a little better. So they actually remember all the information a little better, consistent with the idea that with age, it's about a 1 year on average older sample, and your memory gets a little bit better with age overall. So what's interesting about that? Well, what's interesting is you have plausibly a homologous system with other primates, right? So this may be the same social danger learning system or a modified version of the same social danger learning system that's present in macaques. But in the macaque study that Susan Meinecke and colleagues did, it was observing a fear face of a conspecific that led to acquisition of the fear. In this case, it's telling them, using the words of their own language, what's dangerous or not. And so there appears to be some kind of interaction, right? This mechanism has in some way it's now able to be, to interact with the language system. And of course, this violates the idea of innateness of phenotypic outcomes, right? Because the actual information that the child has as an adult is not innately specified, it's learned. Two more studies real quick. So here's another study that challenges, I think, the Fodorian view of what an adaptation might be. George Gergely and his colleagues in Budapest used a version of a light box that was developed by a developmental psychologist, Andy Meltzoff, to study imitation. And what they did was, this box is a very simple box that has a light on top that's a kind of dome. And if you press it, it lights up. And Meltzoff originally did a study with this to show that very young children, infants, can actually imitate a novel behavior that they've never seen before. And so in Meltzoff's study, a demonstrator, an adult demonstrator, would show the box, lean over, and depress the button on top with their forehead, causing it to light up, push the box over to the baby, and a baby of a year old will lean down and press the box with their forehead too, turning it on, right? And the baby's never seen this kind of, well, probably never seen this kind of behavior before. Okay, so they're it's an interesting thing about humans that they will do this, and that babies appear intrinsically motivated to imitate in this way. George Gergely did an interesting take on this, showing that it's not just imitation, there's actually much more going on. So he had two conditions. In one condition, he has the demonstrator say, oh, it's really cold in here, brr. And then she takes a shawl or a blanket and puts it over herself in such a way that her hands are wrapped up in the shawl, and then leans over and depresses the light box with her forehead. In another condition, she does the same thing. She says, brr, it's cold in here, puts the shawl on, but critically leaves her hands free and puts them on the desk, and then leans forward and depresses the button with her head. Now think to yourself what you would do if you were asked, if you saw this and were given the box. What you find is that very different behaviors on the part of the babies depending on context. So in the hands occupied condition on the left here, most of the babies, about 80% of them, actually reached out with their hand and pressed the button. And in the case where the demonstrator had her hands free, something like 70% of the babies actually directly imitated the head touching behavior. Now what does that mean? The analogy I like to think of is if you see a colleague running for the elevator and she has a bundle of papers in her arms and she uses her knee to press the button on the elevator, you would not infer from that one should use your knee to press the button on the elevator. You would realize that she was constrained and that people normally use their hands. But you can imagine situations where if you were in some foreign culture, somebody had their hands free and they intentionally used their knee to do some behavior that might be what you're supposed to do. And it appears that the babies do think that, well, she has her hands free and she's using her head anyway, so it must be something about the head. And they've done a bunch of follow-up studies with this, but the point is, this shows there's interaction with some kind of a reasoning process here, right? This doesn't really work with the automaticity idea. And, you know, blankets are probably not innately specified part of the conceptual machinery of infants, for example, right? So the behavior is quite different depending on the context. Last item, this is a study by Kylie Hamlin and colleagues that shows you show infants a little character, in this case the red guy with the googly eyes, quote unquote trying to get up a hill. And I'm using the word trying because there's nothing in the stimulus that doesn't say trying. You just see this guy repeatedly making 3 efforts to get up the hill, and then in one condition, a little yellow triangle comes and pushes them up the hill and over to the other side. In another condition, you see these 3 tries, but then the evil green square comes from atop the hill and pushes the red guy down. And there's actually, it's a 2x2 thing where these are the animate conditions, and then there's an inanimate one where it appears to just be sort of a ball going uphill. And really interesting results. What the DV here, the dependent variable, is a little tray comes out, and the babies can choose which of these 2 objects they'd like to select, either the yellow or the blue guy. And you see very strong preference for babies to take the helper, the quote-unquote helper. Now, this is an extremely large effect size for those of you who are familiar with baby studies. This is a very large effect size. And it's been replicated. It's an interesting finding. So these 3 things show that there's probably it's quite plausible that there are adaptations involved here. But if there are, they're probably not Fodorian in nature. They appear to be flexible. They're not automatic because the Lightbox study I think shows that the behavior is quite flexible depending on the context. Probable interaction with some central processes like theory of mind. And older and newer mechanisms might be interacting. So in the case of the danger learning study, possibly a phylogenetically old mechanism that was not previously activated by language because macaques don't have spoken language, now is able to interact with human linguistic capacities. And so, among the things that we're going to have to explain, part of the story is going to involve that humans have large brains. And I'll return to that a little bit later in the talk. But I think the key thing here is that it's not just big brains. There's a lot of things about human cognition, even human learning, and even cultural transmission in humans, that are quite inferential in nature and that probably involve specialized mechanisms of some kind. So even if you compare a species like a capuchin, where capuchins do have social learning and they can learn things from others, the actual nature of the learning is quite different. So capuchins can learn how to, say, crack a nut using a rock, but it takes them many years to learn it, and compared to humans, they don't seem to immediately grasp the means-end relationship, or even to entertain means-end relationships in the same way that a human child would do, observing the exact same thing. And so there's probably a combination of homologous and derived traits where across primates there actually probably are shared traits that explain human learning and capuchin learning, but there's probably also derived traits in humans and possibly in capuchins that can account for different abilities in the 2 species. How do we theorize this? Okay, so here are some of the theoretical ingredients I think we'll need, and one of them is going to be good old-fashioned natural selection. By that I'm going to mean descent with modification, which is important for reasons I'll come to in a second. And I think that we're also going to have to start thinking about brain mechanisms. Part of what I mean by a biologically realistic view of brain mechanisms is we're going to have to think of them in the same way that evolutionary developmental biologists think about the evolution and development of other traits and structures in the body. In the case of plastic traits like brain mechanisms, we're going to have to think about reaction norms, which I'll come to in a second, and homology, so the evolution of things from other things and the reuse of building blocks in making them. And a final ingredient I'll be talking about is what I'm calling evolutionary feedback, the idea that, for example, humans, if brain mechanisms that evolve that enable human culture, that in turn changes the environment in which humans are evolving, which feeds back on the selection on the mechanisms themselves. So I'll be using simplified diagrams like this. You might not be able to see the colors that well, but this is just meant to be a brain. So it's a gray square, and I'll be identifying mechanisms or traits within the brain. Okay, now you can think of these in terms of modules, but as we'll see in a moment, you could also perhaps think of them as properties, anything that biologists might consider a trait. These can evolve through descent with modification such that there will, in the descendant taxa of this ancestral taxon, there will now be modified versions of whatever that trait might be. And what I mean by feedback is that, for example, changes in a particular lineage in the environment, for example, but also changes caused by the evolution of that mechanism itself, can alter selection pressure later on in the lineage, leading to divergences between them. Reaction norms, this is a concept that is well known in some parts of biology, but not in all parts of biology. And a reaction norm, this was an idea originally developed back in the 40s and earlier. Waddington also talks about similar kinds of ideas. And a reaction norm is just a mapping function between a genotype, the environments that the genotype is put into, and the phenotype that develops as a result. So a typical kind of reaction norm that you would see in a biology textbook would be a mapping function between, say, the temperature that an organism grows up in, its age, and its body size. And it's some kind of a surface there for that kind of reaction norm. Another one that I sometimes show in my classes, and that sometimes takes people back because they don't like to think about this as in terms of reaction norms. This is a reaction norm chart showing what happens when you take a human of essentially any genotype and place them into the linguistic environments of northeastern South America. If you take a human and raise them in any one of these environments, this chart shows what language they will end up speaking as an adult. So this shows the linguistic reaction norm of humans when you place them in those environments. Note that if you placed a squirrel or an octopus in the same environment, you would not get the same phenotypic outcome, right? So this is an interaction between the genes that humans have, the environments that they grow up in, and the phenotypic outcomes they experience. And people don't often think about things like the language you speak as part of your phenotype, but if we're going to think about how the evolution of mechanisms that are involved in culture and learning, of course those have to be part of the phenotype that we think about. And here's another one that's even more mind-boggling, but I think this is a reaction norm too. This shows the outcomes of the 2004 presidential election, where the red areas show people that voted for George W. Bush, and the green areas show people who voted for John Kerry. Now, of course, there was migration and other things here, but to a first approximation, this is the political attitude that you have when you're a human raised in this particular part of California. And that, too, is the kind of thing that we have to think of as being part of human reaction norms. Why does this matter? It's not just conceptual, it matters because many of my colleagues would say that if I observe this, or if I observe this, I can't be looking at adaptations because there's variable outcomes. And lots of people think that, lots of people in the social sciences anyway, think that if it's an adaptation, it has to develop the same way everywhere. Basically what Fodor thought. And therefore, well, adaptations can't explain people's voting behavior or their linguistic behavior because they're variable across environments. And I think that's not true, and we should stop thinking that. Another ingredient is something that I'm calling module spawning, and this is not a term that's in the literature. But all I mean here is the developmental processes that generate structures in the mind, right? Mechanisms or modules, or however you want to think about it. And I mean here quite to draw an explicit analogy to the Evo-Devo literature, where the development of body morphology in, for example, bilaterian animals like a human or a fruit fly or a mouse can be thought of as a process of module spawning, where you start with undifferentiated cells, and then in the process of development, those cells differentiate into specialized structures. And there's a combination of evolved procedures that do that, but that also use local environmental information. In this case, internal environmental information internal to the organism about where that cell is in the developing organism to, quote-unquote, decide what kind of structure to develop into. And there's no reason to think that those kinds of processes couldn't also be happening in the brain. Indeed, it's parsimonious to imagine that they probably are the best explanation for brain differentiation, given that that's how brain differentiation works everywhere else, how morphological differentiation works everywhere else in biology. And so I think we can distinguish roughly between a couple different types of module spawning processes that I'm going to tell you about. We can think about the development of types of modules that have particular computational designs, and I'll tell you a little bit what I mean by that in a second. And we want to distinguish that carefully from the development of tokens. So the actual phenotypic outcome that you might get in the brain of a developed human. That might be a specific token of a more general type that any human could develop given the environment that it's put in. So for example, I might have developmental tokens of the English language in my brain, even though my developmental system doesn't contain any English-specific adaptations, right? I can still view my English-speaking ability as a token of a more general type of ability that might have been selected for. And we'll also want to think a little bit about closed versus open dimensions of reaction norms, which I'll talk about in a sec. So what do I mean by module spawning? Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's another cartoon brain, and we can think about a region of this brain that might be initially, early on in development, equipotential. And by equipotential, what I mean is, that doesn't mean it can develop into just anything, but you can think about something like a stem cell, where stem cells can't develop into just anything, but there is some early developmental state where it could have many different outcomes depending on what happens to it. Those are equipotential in that sense. And this initially equipotential tissue receives inputs from other areas in the brain during development. You can imagine several different types of developmental processes. One are the processes that develop types. So an example would be things like dominance columns. You probably know that in the visual cortex. Input to the visual cortex shapes particular kinds of mechanisms in the developed cortex as a function of the neural input that those areas are receiving. That might have a particular type of computational format. And I've put here sort of as a shorthand different cartoon functions. So you can imagine that some neural areas might be like a regression, the typical kind of thing that a neural network will do, where essentially what it does is it averages all the inputs sent to that area. That's essentially what a neural network does. You could also imagine, we know that there's neural mechanisms that act as gates, like an OR gate. It says either this or that, and it has a nonlinear kind of function. It's activated, for example, when it gets two inputs, but not if it gets only one of those inputs, right? And that's different than a computational structure that averages the inputs. And you can imagine a whole bunch of other ones as well, the kinds of things that, for example, Bayesian updating procedures that might be common to lots of neural tissue. So those would be computational types. You can also imagine what I'm calling here bifurcation processes. So what began as a single computational unit in the brain, there might be some developmental events that cause it to split into two units. And there's been some models of this in the neural network literature when what is a single neural network might decide to become two neural networks when they're receiving essentially very nonlinear, two different categories of input. And there can be mechanisms that say, I'm receiving two very different kinds of input. I'm going to split into two networks in order to process those two separately. And you might imagine that those could be quite common throughout the brain. And then finally, what I'm calling token generating processes. So we'll talk about in a second. Things like object recognition areas where there might be initially regions of the brain that are dedicated, they have certain computational processes that are good for, say, categorizing objects, but through ontogenesis, they might specialize in recognizing faces, or recognizing animals, or recognizing artifacts. And this view, I mean, if this is a correct view of how brain regions develop, or at least if there's some element of plausibility to this, it poses a problem for us empirically. So if these kinds of module spawning processes can involve contingent specialized procedures, including something that lots of people haven't thought of, but there's rapidly increasing evidence for differential gene expression in the brain as a function of where and when the tissue is developing during the lifespan. If different genes are turned on and off at different points in development in different parts of the brain, you can have contingent procedures that say, I'm getting this kind of input, turn these genes on, turn me into this particular kind of computational structure. And that's a problem because when you think back to the Quartz and Sinowski quote where they say, well, early on in development there's no domain specificity, therefore there's no specialization in the cortex. That's a big problem because if you look early on in development at, say, the embryo of a fruit fly, you would draw the conclusion that there can't be any specialized procedures for limb development because I've looked early on in development and there's no specialization there. So I think that's a problem for us in studying the brain. It just means that the lack of differentiation early in development doesn't rule out the possibility of specialization. There's examples of this. There's been a bunch of studies on phase perception and object perception. And this is just one study that shows throughout the life course, beginning in early childhood through adulthood, you see increasing specialization of brain areas for recognizing faces, for recognizing places, essentially, and for recognizing objects. What might be going on here is that at birth, you have a relatively undifferentiated area of the brain that's receiving input characteristic of objects. And I've put them as fuzzy inputs here because if you have undifferentiated areas, processing might be relatively fuzzy early on in development. And through these kinds of module spawning processes that I'm talking about, you get continued inputs of faces and objects, and you start to get a better differentiated object system that's dedicated specifically to recognizing objects. I've put here interaction with other systems because there's a lot of evidence that this interacts with things like motivational systems. Kids like to look at faces, right? So you can imagine that if there's a mechanism that says, look at this thing a lot, even though you don't have initially you don't have a differentiated face recognition ability, that's going to cause lots of input to be sent to the object recognition area and force increasing specialization for faces. And if you continue to get more and more faces and objects, you can, through these bifurcation processes, you might get specialized systems. And this has implications for debates. So in the face recognition literature, there's many sides, but there's two very prominent sides, which are the expertise view, which says the reason that we have a specialized face recognition area is because we're experts at looking at faces because we look at them a lot. And there's a domain specificity view that says evolution has favored the development of a specialized face recognition area. If this kind of scenario for how that area develops is true, it's hard to tell the difference between those accounts. They're essentially making the same kinds of predictions. That early on in development, you'll see relatively less specialization that will become increasingly fine-grained during development. And I'll return in a second to what I mean by this hierarchically nested view of specialization, which I think is a view that is it's neither of the two views that I presented at the beginning. Okay, the final ingredient I want to talk about is homology. And this is the idea that adaptations evolve from older adaptations. And it turns out that it's been proposed many times that brain regions might evolve through a process of duplication and divergence, where structures in the brain duplicate and then they diverge. And in molecular biology, this idea was proposed by Ono in a book in 1970, that molecules might evolve in the genome, that genes might evolve through duplication and divergence. And since he proposed that, there's been a lot of evidence that that is one of the major mechanisms for increasing amounts of specialization in the genome, essentially. And there's lots of evidence now in other areas of development. So, for example, the development of limbs in fruit flies and mice and humans, that those have evolved through processes of duplication and divergence. And there's some terminology that's used in this literature. This was originally developed by Fitch to talk about genes, but I think you can actually use it to talk about phenotypes as well. So these are varieties of homology. Homologs are any two traits across taxa that evolve from a shared origin in some ancestral taxon. And Fitch distinguished between orthologs. So those orthologs are homologs which have a shared origin before the last common ancestor of those two taxa, right? And so you can imagine that humans and mice or humans and dogs might have lots of orthologous adaptations in the brain that actually diverged before the common ancestor of those two taxa. And then there's another term called paralogs, which is origin via duplication, so what's otherwise sometimes called serial homology. And in paralogs evolved since the last common ancestor, so if this was an ancestral mechanism in the brain and it duplicated and diverged, then in this taxon here, these two mechanisms would be imparalogous. They're basically homologs of each other that evolved through a duplication and diversion process since this guy. And if they continue to duplicate and diverge, in these descendant taxa, you can have, for example, these two, which are imparalogs. They evolved through duplication and divergence since the last common ancestor. But there's actually also outparalogs across these two taxa. They have multiple modules, which are copies of each other, tracing back to a duplication event earlier on in evolution. So that's pretty fancy terminology, but I think it's useful for talking about this kind of stuff. And you can conceptually imagine two other terms, orthoplasia and paraplasia, which aren't really present in the literature, but those would be convergently evolved traits. And you can imagine that in brains, there might be convergently evolved features as well. So let me give you an example of how this might work in human evolution. You can imagine some very ancestral state, and this is probably some pre-mammalian organism, where it has some kind of specialized object perception processes, but no processes specialized to recognize particular categories of objects. Fast forward to the chimp-human common ancestor, it's quite likely, because we found place perception specializations and phase perception specializations in other species of primates through things like signal neuron recordings, that there were separate specializations for, say, phase perception and place perception in the chimp-human common ancestor. In Homo sapiens, there might be yet more specialized object recognition systems, and we might be in the process actually of observing the evolution of a new one for recognizing written language. So what happens when specialization meets novel environments? Stanislaus Dehaene has a new book called Reading in the Brain. Some interesting research that they've done showing what they call the visual word form area. So these are areas of the brain that are preferentially activated or specifically activated when shown written words. And what's interesting about these, that there's a bunch of interesting features of them, but they're in object recognition areas. They're specific to words. And what's perhaps most interesting is that some of the areas that they've identified, it doesn't matter what font you show the word in. It doesn't matter whether it's uppercase or lowercase. It doesn't matter, for example, if it's a mixture of upper or lowercase letters. And I didn't write it here, but imagine in your mind the uppercase word dog and the lowercase word dog, right? Uppercase D and a lowercase d don't look the same. The O does. Uppercase G and a lowercase g don't look the same, right? But these areas are... So what's happening here is there's some higher level integration of information such that, and this is sometimes called, one model for this is what's sometimes called the pandemonium model, where there are systems in early visual cortex that are taking features of the letters and then integrating them into some higher level percept that actually is essentially invariant across different instantiations of the word. Very interesting specialization, and it appears in the same place in all literate people that have been looked at. Now this seems weird, right? Because you think, well, how old is written language? It's a couple thousand years old, right? I mean, best case scenario, 10,000 years old, something like that. So how can there be specializations in the brain for words? What's even more interesting is Mark Changizi has, now this is you got to go look at this paper yourself to see if you believe it. This is a really astounding result. But what he does is he takes natural scenes and he categorizes what the intersections look like in natural scenes. And then he takes the intersections that are present in letters, right? So you can think of a T junction versus an X junction versus the kind of junctions that are in A's. He maps out all those kinds of junctions and then the frequency of them in visual scenes, photographs, and text. And this is the graph that shows that the junctions that you see in visual scenes overlap, the distribution of those junctions overlaps very heavily with the distribution that you see in written language, which suggests that, his proposal is that human languages have evolved so that the letters that we have in human languages have culturally evolved through a process of variation and retention of the ones that our visual system is good at discriminating. And so this is a very interesting story, right? Because you have presumably some kind of pre-existing object recognition areas that have some degree of plasticity. Then you have the evolution of words, which through a cultural evolution process, the ones that work well with our brain end up making it into the languages that we see today. And you get this interaction between cultural input and the brain to create an area that's specialized that occurs in the same place in all people that can read.
Is the pattern true for very different languages like English and Chinese?
Yes, supposedly. Although, you know, you can look at the literature. I don't know how many people have actually been, I don't know how many cultures that their actual like fMRI studies have done. But the claim is that it's true in people that speak different languages like Chinese and English. And this thing includes written characters of many different language writing types. So it's not just, say, Arabic numerals and Roman type of letters, but also other kinds of languages. And so what you might be seeing here is, you know, the appearance of a new module through serial homology, duplication, and divergence in an area of the human brain. But of course, this is probably an ongoing process because in people who don't learn to speak a language, not all humans learn to speak a language, and so there hasn't, presumably this area is not present, or it's not used for the same thing in people who don't speak a language. Okay, so now let me wrap up here. I think this also would be useful to start thinking about this when we think about more so-called higher level processes. And there's been some interesting work looking at social perception in the brain and where it is and what kinds of networks are activated, and it's quite possible that serial homology processes are involved here too. So the hierarchical specialization view that I'm proposing would be that you have features of you have mechanisms that are appearing in the brain at points in evolution, and what happens is that, so for example, in very early brains, you might see things, basic properties like Bayesian updating properties that might be general to lots and lots of neural systems. At some later stage, the ability to form visual object categories, right? And so all descendants of those are going to have mechanisms that have these general neural properties, plus they're good at recognizing objects. Then you might have more and more specialized mechanisms being selected for. What does that mean? It means that when you look at the brains of these species, what you might see is that specialization is in fact hierarchical. So that if I were to pick, the aplysia nervous system might contain certain types of neural mechanisms that are actually present in octopi and wrasses and capuchins and humans. They're still there, potentially. But in addition, these other species may have derived forms that have some of those features of those older systems, but also have specialized features as well. And what this means is that, so you can imagine some some system in the brain of a human that's very good at identifying tools, for example, and it might have a combination of specialized and generalized properties within that same mechanism. What does that mean? It means that is tool use being handled by a general purpose or a specialized mechanism is no longer a meaningful question, because the mechanism that's handling tools might have a combination of specialized and generalized features. Not that there's one system that's general purpose and another system that's specialized. That's a possibility that should be on the table that, as far as I know, is just not on the table in psychology right now. Okay, almost done. Lots of things we have to explain about humans. This is a pruned phylogeny of hominins, starting from the chimp-human common ancestor, and we know through the paleoanthropological record and the archaeological record that we have some information about changes that happened. So we know things from fossils about brain size and when it increased. We know that increase in brain size has to be part of the story. We actually know that there were roughly 2 bursts in brain size in humans, one around the origin of what's called our genus Homo, and another much more recent one accompanying the origin of Homo sapiens. And we know about certain events that happen. So bipedalism happened very early, and we have evidence for when certain kinds of things happen in the human lineage, like the appearance of stone tools. I've put in here in dotted line all of these things that we're going to need to have to explain, things that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, things like language, complex artifacts, a fully human theory of mind, social cognition, but also other kinds of things. We know that humans have extremely good motor control. We're very good at manipulating things with our hands. And what we might think about is processes where there was some ancestral chimp human brain that already had a lot of specialized stuff in it. And at these different points in human evolution, you may see the appearance of new mechanisms through processes of duplication and divergence, such that if you were to be able to look into the brains of these ancestral humans, what you might see is something like an already semi-modular brain that involves degrees of specialization that may not be, or perhaps different specializations than those are present in outgroups. And the role of feedback in this is thinking about when, so for example, when you have a brain that starts to be able to specialize in identifying particular kinds of tools, right, that's actually going to have effects on the environment because humans will be making more and more specialized kinds of tools, accelerating selection for those specialized abilities. And I think that's clear when we think about the Dehaene scenario for the evolution of word recognition. It's that part of the brain is actually, the evolution of that part of the brain is creating environments where there's words now to be seen and learned. And so the main take-home message that I like to give you is that I think, so if you go and look at the literature in psychology, the debate over is it specialized or is it general purpose, that is pervasive in the psychological literature, and I'm trying to suggest that thinking of that as an either-or proposition might not be the only way to think about the evolution of brain specializations or brain processes in general. There's a problem for us, which is right now when you look at standards of evidence for ruling in or ruling out or falsifying hypotheses about specialization or generalization, generally what you have is a situation where people think that the general purpose hypothesis is always the more parsimonious one. And so when you see something like shared processing across different types of tasks in psychology, so if there's some feature of processing that's similar for faces and other kinds of objects, the default assumption is there can't be specialized procedures going on because there's shared processing. But if this hierarchical specialization view is right, then there are going to be certain kinds of things like general properties of neural networks that are going to also be inherited by specialized neural networks as well. And so seeing those doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility of specialized mechanisms. So what we're going to need in that kind of environment is something a little bit less like null hypothesis testing and something a little bit more like model comparison, where you're comparing models that are equal levels of biological plausibility and getting data that basically creating a horse race in your data such that, you know, the data speak either for this model or for this model, but not ruling out not using essentially null hypothesis testing to say it's either this or something generalized which we don't know what it is. And of course we're going to have to think more carefully about, we're going to have to use anthropological data, paleoanthropological data, archaeological data to inform psychological theories, which isn't done enough these days. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Clark.
Yeah.
So now we're going to have some Q&A,
Sure.
and I'll just start off, and I was wondering if you can go back a few slides.
Yeah.
So I love your talk, and I love all your different explanations, and I think it's a really interesting model.
Yep.
And I wanted
How
to
many slides?
go back, I think. Yeah, right there.
Okay.
But this slide made me want to cry because it just repeats story of humans being special and everything building toward humans. And I just wanted to challenge that question. Is this model that you're saying, you talk about it in terms of human specialization, are you really saying that this type of modularity and development is only really developed in humans and it's kind of leading for that? Or wouldn't you expect this to really be happening all over the board in different directions?
Yes,
If
absolutely.
that's what
I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, my intention was to talk about this debate specifically with respect to humans, but if you study capuchins or if you study octopi, presumably there's lots of specializations in octopi that aren't present in humans.
Right.
So absolutely, it's more of a
So you would just be
tree
seeing,
than
other letters branching out.
Absolutely, yes. That's the idea. But I mean, and what this was intended to show was more the idea that when new adaptations appear, they don't necessarily discard the features of older adaptations, and in fact, more often than not, they retain them. And so you're going to see ancestral properties that are present in newer adaptations as well. That was the main point of this. But I absolutely agree. This is not intended to show that humans are
Special.
Right. Although I would say, for people who do comparative brain anatomy and comparative brain development, I mean, there are ways in which primate brains are more complex than octopus brains. There are ways in which human brains are more complex than the cat brains. We have more frontal lobe, for example, and so there's an open question. I mean, the typical way of seeing things now is that you had selection for, say, one kind of developmental gene that made the neocortex larger, and that's it, end of story. But there may be other possibilities. That's all I intended to show.
Okay, so we'd like to open it up to other questions.
So Clark, in my own analysis of comparisons across organ systems, what's interesting is that when you reduce it to the molecular level, you no longer see that what you see is what you get. So in other words, it starts to reveal the fact that the same toolkit is being used in different ways. So I think this is really interesting, but I think it's only at the surface of what really is going to give us insight into how the brain has evolved in response to systemic pressures, and that interaction is really what's going to reveal the processes that you're talking about.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And examples that I can think of are things like how neurotransmitters, hormones, other kinds of, say, people like to think, well, oxytocin, that's the love chemical or something like that, right? But I mean, really, what you might have is you might have a bunch of cases where a particular widely spread, highly conserved kind of brain chemical actually has different effects on different target tissues through a process of evolution and differentiation. And so in that case, what you're going to see is the same molecule, like serotonin or dopamine or whatever, that actually doesn't do the same thing everywhere. And that's something that I think brain scientists and biologists are aware of, but I don't think that psychologists are quite as aware of that might be a possibility, because typically brain chemicals are thought of as having a single function, like increased affiliation or something like that.
Certainly molecular biologists don't appreciate that, but that the phylogenetic and ontogenetic comparisons are very important, because it's the history of the organism, and that's how you see those iterative processes of how they spell out these different phenotypes.
Yeah.
I had a completely different question.
Okay.
It's actually, I think, the next slide about the theory of mind, and I was curious how one might know from the fossil record that 5 to 7 million years ago we would know that.
We don't know that, and that's why I put the dotted line there. So any of these.
But the very last one, the some theory of mind. Oh, is that just a?
Oh well, some theory of mind, we know that from comparative work with other animals. So chimpanzees have fairly sophisticated. Yeah. So the only thing that chimpanzees haven't been shown to be able to do is to track false beliefs, but they actually track who knows what. So they track. So they're actually. They know when a dominant individual sees a piece of food that, or doesn't see a piece of food that they can see, right? And so I think that we shouldn't think of theory of mind as being just false belief understanding. We should think of it as abilities to make inferences about others' intentions. And so, and that's my personal idiosyncratic use. So to me, if one dog growls at another dog and bares its teeth and the other dog understands that it has it's being aggressive, that is a version of, that's a precursor or a homologue of certain also facial expression, interpretation mechanisms that humans have, right? And so I would call that, I have a very broad definition of theory of mind. But you're right, in the literature, a lot of people have wanted to say it's false belief tracking only. And chimps can't do that, but they can do almost everything except that. Yes?
Would it be useful to distinguish between specialization at the level of what the brain itself is doing in order to generate a certain capacity, and the capacity itself as to whether it's a specialized capacity or a very general capacity? Because what I'm thinking of is in something like the work that I do with kinship terminologies, that one can make a sort of a nice argument in terms of at the level of capacity of what you can do, of going from relatively more specialized kind of behaviors, like tracing out genealogically mother's, father's, son's, daughter kind of capacity, which probably came in first. And then as we shifted to the ability to be able to think about kin relations symbolically, then at the level of the production side, it becomes extremely generalized and has led to an enormous variety of different kinds of terminologies. But I imagine that one might be able to say at the level of the brain itself, in terms of what it's doing to be able to make that change, that you're talking about a more specialized aspect of the brain when it is able to do the symbolic computations, that the level of product is no longer specialized but opens up and becomes generalized. So it would be useful to make that sort of distinction between where we're talking about the specialization coming in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And what I think of in this case, for example, so your example of kinship is a good one, but I also think about metaphor in humans, right? So there's a bunch of research suggesting that humans have quite flexible abilities to use metaphor. And where I think, if I had to guess, where I think why that's enabled is because of interactions between mechanisms that maybe didn't previously interact, or the evolution of some kind of mechanism that is able to bridge across different mechanisms that previously didn't talk to each other, so that now humans can use, humans can use their spatial cognition mechanisms to think about time, and there's a lot of evidence that when we think about time abstractly, we're using space to think about time. And that may make use of much more ancient, specialized space cognition mechanisms, but now they've somehow been co-opted, and I think the way I would think it's happening is through some sorts of connections being formed with another kind of system that enable you to then map time onto space. And so it's not loss of specialization in that case. I would say the specialization is retained, but you get flexibility. You get more flexibility when you combine specialized stuff than when the specialized stuff was operating in isolation. And I suspect that that's how a lot of human flexibility happens, is through communication of systems that didn't previously communicate. And with kinship, it could be, you have these very ancient kinship mechanisms that have certain algebraic features, right? And those then become accessible to language and symbol manipulation, and that creates flexibility that wasn't there before, but it's not losing the ancestral specialization that was there. That's good. Yeah.
So Clark, how do you see this kind of thinking informing what we're doing in cognitive neuroscience?
Yeah.
Because finally these two disciplines are starting to talk, and maybe the last 5 years. But I see this kind of a theoretical approach as kind of, maybe it's my bias saying this is top down and what I do is bottom up, looking in the brain. But we can look in the brain and we can start to get some ideas of specializations that exist because area A lights up and area B doesn't when you do a given task. But then again, what you're kind of talking about would be a hypothesis generating mechanism for looking in the brain for certain things. So I wonder if you have any sort of specific thoughts about how you can...
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that I think there's a historical reason when you look at the literature on brain evolution, for example. People generally don't like to be adaptationist in that literature, and the reason is because you have homology. So if you're somebody who looks at the embryology of bird brains and fish brains and rat brains, then you can say, well, these structures are homologous, and you can look for homologies without necessarily thinking too much about function or things like that. And so you're on safer ground. And so I think that there's I think that I don't know, but I think that may be true in some areas of cognitive neuroscience where you can do things like fMRI where you're restricting yourself to some sort of a task analysis. And you say, well, look, we just know that if you do this task, this happens. If you do this task, this happens. And that allows a form of parsimony, or just not going beyond the data. That means that you don't necessarily have to do much more than that if you don't want to. And so the top-down, I don't know if it's top-down, but to use your terms, what this is trying to do is to say there's not a choice between those two necessarily, like we can do both. And things like, I think that people already know this in the neuroscience literature, right? That face recognition, other kinds of object recognition, they occupy adjacent territory to some degree, right? In the temporal lobe and other kinds of areas. So that suggests homology right there. But people haven't yet, it seems like there's still a ways to go in thinking about how those might have evolved from the same ancestral mechanism. So I would say that pieces of evidence you could use would be, with caution, things like adjacency. I say with caution because you can't always do that. But that's one piece of evidence, right? That these things are located in similar areas, that they receive similar inputs. Other kinds of things that you would typically use when thinking about homology in evolutionary biology, like looking at embryology, right? Looking farther back in development and seeing what structures these structures come from. The technologies aren't as good to do that in neuroscience because it's difficult to do brain mapping of babies and things like that. But as those things happen. And then the final ingredient is it would be wonderful if we could come up with some equivalent of an fMRI machine for gene expression, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, but my suspicion is that, so in other species, in order to do this, you expose animals to a particular kind of environment, you kill them, and then you do gene sequencing, you look at do expression studies of gene expression in the brain, and there's regional gene expression at different parts during development. And if we can do that with humans, not kill them, but come up with methods for studying gene expression, I think that's going to add massive amounts of power for thinking about this kind of stuff. But yeah, so you're right that the empirical implications are mostly, some of the ones I presented are mostly not good because they mean that it's harder to differentiate between these theories, not easier. But I think that that's something that we have to face, because I think right now, I know in psychology, the methods for distinguishing between specialized and general. So just to give you an example, cognitive load is a method that's often used in psychology. You make somebody memorize a bunch of numbers and keep them in mind while they're doing some other task. If you see interference, then an adaptation is not involved in the process. That's the inference that's been drawn by some people, and there's no reason to infer that at all. Unless you think that in order to be an adaptation, two mechanisms can't interact with each other. So I think the situation is still not good for testing between these hypotheses, but really we need to have the most realistic theories if our data are going to tell us the way that things really work. So that may be a little bit of a waffle in response, but that's the best I can do. Yeah.
I'm sorry I missed what you meant by crude parsimony on your last
Yes.
slide. It seems that when you're comparing alternative models, we're using parsimony, so I'm not understanding what you're contrasting that type of parsimony to.
Yeah, what I mean by I'm not anti-parsimony, but I mean that in biology, parsimony has a good reputation in some areas, like the reconstruction of phylogenies, although Bayesian methods are now starting to take over from parsimony methods, it seems to me. But if you were to say, let's say that we were to try to infer the developmental processes that are responsible for limb differentiation in Drosophila, those don't appear to be the most parsimonious ways of doing it. And in general, in biology, it's not the case that the structure that's actually evolved is the simplest way of getting something done. And so what I mean is that you have to use caution when you're looking at a biologically evolved structure, that it's not necessarily, you need to think of, it's more important to think about plausible evolutionary pathways for the evolution of mechanisms and to compare different plausible ones rather than to assume that the most simplest one is the. But in general, I agree with you. If there, the general idea, if there's this theory that postulates X and there's this theory that postulates X plus Y, and you don't have any reason to favor the X plus Y over the X, then you should probably take the X. I do agree with that. I just think that it's often misused in psychology for differentiating between these two hypotheses, because the general purpose signatures are often the only things that are used to distinguish between a domain general and domain specific account, when in fact those signatures of processing you might expect to hold true across a lot of different accounts. Things like Bayesian updating is probably something that is a general property of lots of brain systems. I mean, we see it in vision, we see it in concept learning, at least plausibly we see it in these areas, right? And that, I would guess, is through homology. Yeah?
So how much do you think coming up with like biologically reasonable, given what we know about biologically reasonable kind of neuroanatomy and homology, how much of that constrain adaptationist logic?
Okay, say it again.
Sorry. Given like the current state of knowledge with
Yeah.
respect to how things are instantiated in brains
Yes.
and what are homologous structures versus novel adaptations, how much should current knowledge about neuroanatomy and figuring out kind of the phylogeny within the brain constrain adaptationist logic? Or theorizing?
How much should it constrain? If I get what you're saying, I think quite a bit. I mean, I think that so you're talking about things like comparative studies.
So it could be kind of knowing what the wet material looks like.
Yes.
It could be understanding what are the homologous structures in
Yeah.
animals. Like we do know some of that. We don't. I take.
We do.
The speaker's point about the fact that there's gaps in levels of analysis, connecting levels of analysis.
Right. Well, let me give you an example and see if this is the kind of thing you're talking about. So it's quite plausible that at least some of ontogenetic differentiation and specialization in the brain is a function of what information gets projected where during development, right? And so what we know about what information gets projected where should constrain our theories, right? So if at least in part, right, if a brain area is, if we think that it's specialized to do X, Y, or Z, then whether or not it receives information about X, Y, or Z during development, which could be just an anatomical fact, I think it should be an important factor in thinking about that.
Well, I guess
Right,
I don't know how much we
and
know
there's-
about like the full connectivity. So you're mentioning things like homologous structures perhaps being next to each other
Yes.
physically. I have to defer to just neuroscientists because I don't know anything about this. But is it possible that there are just communications, ways that different systems communicate with each other that we don't know about yet, or that?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think that those should be on the table.
So even if you don't see that region receiving the input directly, it doesn't mean it doesn't have access to that input.
That's right. Yeah, no. So weakly constrained in that sense. I think it should be part of the story. But here's another example. So it seems as though as brains, and this is something that might surprise a lot of people, but there's evidence that as brains get bigger, they become more modular. So the bigger the brain, and at least part of that comes from, if you just think about connectivity between things, right? If you make a large brain, and you increase the number of neurons in the brain, then you have to make less connections between those areas of the cortex as a physical. It just has to be that way. If you think about This is why, you know, the telephone networks become more modular as they get bigger, because if you imagine a telephone network with 10 people's phones, they can all be directly connected to each other. And as you make more phones and more phones and more phones, you have to have routing hubs and things like that between them. And so there's different definitions of modularity, but one definition of modularity has to do with is everything connected to everything else, or are they subdivided in some ways? And there's a lot of evidence for modularity in that sense. And so that may constrain, you know, that kind of thing may be a driving factor for the evolution of specialization, because it creates a situation that might favor increasing differentiation of areas because they're communicating with each other less. I mean, that's totally bizarre, because a lot of people think that as you make brains bigger, they become more general purpose, but it seems like it could be the other way around. And so that's a fact that we know from comparative studies. Fact is too strong of a word, but it's a strong conjecture that's used from comparative studies that should constrain, you know, our ideas. It's more plausible that bigger brains are more modular than the other way around, from homology and sort of physical constraint point of view. Yeah.
I was wondering what you think about degeneracy and how that might fit into this perspective.
So
you know,
loss of things?
No, where you can get two structurally different mechanisms that can produce the same output.
Yeah.
Just offhand, I think it might facilitate some of the things you're talking about. And the human brain, well, brains in general, but the human brain is, according to lots of scholars, quite degenerate. I mean, if you look at, if you're interested, yeah, if you look at something like parts of the brains that appraisals of the emotional relevance and motivational significance of stimuli, you can see the same things happening in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex of the amygdala and the insula.
So you're saying this idea of sort of, is one way of what you're saying is sort of co-opting functions to some degree by brain areas that didn't previously do those things?
Well,
or that
there may be several of them doing those things.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, one thing that is, so there's two possibilities. Let me mention two possibilities. So there are these findings, very old findings. For example, people like Sir did these studies, these rewiring studies, where you route a type of input, auditory input, say, to an area of cortex that didn't previously show any specialization for auditory processing, and you can get it to show some signatures of specialization for auditory processing. One possibility there is that I think people haven't thought about too much is the sort of epigenetic account that I was talking about, the gene regulation account, which says there may be developmental procedures that say, if I get this kind of input, turn these genes on and turn me into X, Y, or Z, right? And that could be what's happening. That's something that's not generally, I think, on the menu of a lot of people in thinking about those kinds of things. Another kind of thing is that if this kind of account is true, then there may be more general purpose processing features that are widespread across lots of tissue, and therefore it's not implausible that different areas, an area that doesn't normally receive some kind of input can take on certain kinds of processing features if it's exposed to that input through good old-fashioned neuroplasticity. And I think all those possibilities are there. I mean, I don't know to what extent it's empirically the case, like you say, that there's degeneracy or handling of the same kind of thing by multiple brain areas. Norella, do you know?
Just because all of those regions are seen co-activating during say the emotional task, it doesn't mean that they're doing the same thing. It's just because they line up at the same time, no? Right?
Well, it's hard to say. If you take a sort of a set of kinds of appraisals that the brain makes, and you try to sort them out across those three areas, it's very hard because the very same areas do the very same things. Different areas do the very same things.
That I'm just questioning, how do we know that they're doing the same thing?
Well, they're getting the same output in any case. For example, an appraisal of novelty or goal significance, you see in the behavior that.
Well, but the behavior is not the brain.
Yeah.
How do we know that those three brain regions you mentioned are doing the same thing, as opposed to dealing with different aspects of
Just looking
say,
at
some
experimental
sense.
literature, you find out that, in fact, it's difficult to sort it out because you see the same product when the research is done on any one of the three.
Yeah. Let me jump in and say, one thing I think is interesting, and that I think is, so the reading stuff I think is really interesting, because one of the interesting things that wasn't, depending on what your view is, it wouldn't have to have been this way, that every single person, or most people who grew up in a written language environment, develop this visual word form area in basically the same area of the brain. It could have been, this is a novel thing, and so some people it's over here, and some people it's over there, some people it's over there. And it's really interesting empirically that it's not, doesn't seem to be the case. And I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is, that should tell us something. To use Christina's way of putting it, it constrains our theories about what's going on, because it says, yeah, this is a novel input, but the fact that it's always happening here suggests, maybe tells us something about the underlying adaptations, because it's a different story if this is a particular token of an object that's repeatedly exposed, that we're repeatedly exposed to, and so we develop it in this particular place, is a different thing than general purpose neural networks handle this, and therefore it could be anywhere, because it could have been that way.
Well, DeHaene has an interesting speculation about that, which he, in his book, says he was planning to test. I don't know if he's done it yet.
Yeah.
But he thought that part of the brain may have been involved in tracking, looking at
Animal tracks or something.
tracks.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Because.
Sure.
Yeah.
Could be.
And
Could be. But that's that's narrowing down the range of what the underlying, and so and I think those are interesting things to think about. That's going to need some evidence for it, but interesting idea. Yes.
Going back to the first question, which was asked in the slide that caused some controversy.
Oh, the ladder complexity slide? Yes.
So
I'm
it's,
sorry.
looking from the perspective of a human, it's easy to think that our brain is more complex than other brains because we can do things that they cannot do. Now, is there an objective way to decide? You mentioned.
Well, I'm just talking about. So yeah, believe me, I'm the kind of person that would. My theoretical perspective is that I study adaptations. So the idea that an octopus has adaptations that a human doesn't have is exactly my kind of view. But I'm just referring to literature on brain evolution where you can actually see, for example, there's some species that don't have a neocortex. Fishes don't have a neocortex. So there's the neocortex is a thing that does some stuff.
You're looking at the brain, but I'm talking about the mind, behavior.
Yeah.
My guess is that actually the human brain is more complex. But is there a way to make this
more
objective?
neurons.
Or is it our back?
Well, there's very, very crude ways. And one of the problems is that, the state of the art of a lot of comparative literature, it looks at the crudest possible thing. Like there's people who take a brain, stain the nuclei, blend it up, and count how many nuclei there are, and say, humans have X neurons, and macaques have a smaller number of neurons, and you can plot it. And that tells you something interesting, but and it says that on a certain
at the
level, there's more complexity in humans, but we don't know.
My point is that at the level of behavior, we have a bias in looking at behaviors which we understand, right? That's
yes.
And again, I still guess that humans are more complex in behavior, but is there a way to try to
once we
remove
identify
the fact that we are humans doing the experiments?
Yeah, no.
Something.
No, I 100% agree with that view and that view of the evolution of intelligence that for example, that there's other species that have forms of intelligence and mechanisms of intelligence that we don't have. And I don't think that the complexity issue by itself, it's something you could assign a mathematical value to, and it's important, but once we get down to the mechanisms, then it will be less necessary to say A is more complex than B. We'll just be able to say, this is the structure of the thing, these are the genes involved, these are the structures they build. End of story. Because genomes, there's species that have more genes, lots more genes than we do. Are they phenotypically more complex? Are they genomically more complex? They're interesting questions, I'm not denying that, but...
One point of the question is it possible to take out the emotion? Some people like humans to be above others, other people like equality. Can we take this out and somehow try to be objective, right? And I don't know how, but it would be important, right, for science.
It's something we should try to do. Whether I'm not the person, maybe a philosopher, could answer the question of whether we'd be able to.
But it's a question for science.
But yes, one lesson in comparative studies of animal behavior, I think, that is true is that I can think of several cases, and theory of mind is one of them, where making a, like say, ecologically fair test for that species has shown an ability that we didn't think was there when we tested them in ways that weren't, it's not the right word, but not fair for their kind of ecology or social ecology, right? So I think some of the interesting stuff with chimps was when they looked at food competition and they found that competition between chimps over food, you can see evidence that they're tracking what they each know. In cases where a chimp tracking a human experimenter's mental states, they don't track them, and they do other chimps, and so that's not totally answering your question, but I think that's what we should try to do, is try to come up with tests that are more that allow us to do that rather than get rid of the human bias, because I think that's been around, and certainly in comparative studies of behavior, a lot of our tests are very human biased, and you could almost say that you could maybe say the same thing with some developmental stuff, that some of our tests of babies are adult biased. That's another question.
There's a follow-up.
Oh, sorry. Why don't you go ahead with the follow-up, and then we'll wrap up, and we can continue the discussion downstairs in the reception.
The follow-up is, in case we end up concluding that human brains or minds are much more complex than that of other species.
Yeah.
It poses a problem to the way you look at it, doesn't it? Because why? What happened, 6 million years ago, which is nothing, right? Doesn't it?
Yeah, but it poses a problem for complexity of everything, right? So why are there still bacteria and multicellular organisms?
Especially, it sounds like your story is something which the evolution of the brain is quite smooth, right? That's what I got.
Well, I mean, I think it could happen in jumps. I think this is an interesting question. Like we do see two spurts of brain evolution, a brain size increase in the hominin lineage. They're more like it goes like this, and then there's one discontinuity, and then it goes up a little more, and there's another discontinuity. And so there's an interesting question like, did things happen? What happened then at those transitions, if you will? There may be nonlinearities, and it wouldn't be surprising to find, for example, you might find some genes that increase brain size dramatically, and there's been some people that have sort of tried to do this experimentally by looking at whether turning on or off certain genes in the development of the brain can cause greater, say, convolution of the brain all in one step. And I mean, it's not out of the question that you could have some initial event, which is a mutation that makes the brain bigger or more convoluted or increases one area, and then that creates the substrate for later specializations of those areas, for example. So there could be discontinuities, for sure. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.